I will start with a word of prayer. We do thank our God for Christmas, the celebration of this season. Looking forward to a new year, new things, new discoveries. And today we just want to honor T.F. Torrance and the missionary heart that you put in him, and that you would open us up to understand more deeply how he thought, the way he participated in your mission to the world, and that we would find new ways to be those who acknowledge the loneliness in the world and the place that you take in fulfilling that. So teach us all that we need about Torrance and yourself and who we might be in the light of all of it. We pray this all in your name, you who is Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Man.
Good. Well, it's interesting. I was just looking in Joey Sherrard's T.F. Torrance as missional theologian. He did not quote from this doctorate, which was the doctorate, I think, was published in 2016. So it would have been done. He published his book in 2021. So people have talked about the need for more T.F. Torrance biography,
Hmm.
and this is quite compelling for that. And again, um, Caroline's doctorate is also available. I have it in electronic form, and it is quite an extended version of this with a lot. It has other things in it as well, but you can sense kind of the scope of what it is that she was doing. And again, to say the whole sense of T.F. Torrance as a missiologist is to say, noticing that Torrance was formed within his story. And again, his father's story, his own story, his heart for China, all of these things are part of what lays a really different kind of foundation other than T.F. Torrance is just an Edinburgh academic or even just a pastor in Scotland. To say there's a whole layer of dimension of what it might mean to be a missionary, and the role that his family plays in that is quite significant. So, Howard,
How
you're
did
just downloading it. Bill, have you read through it?
how did you come across this particular essay?
That is such a good question. I'm trying to remember how it was because a while back I came across it in doing search, and it came up. It may have been in academia.edu or something. I can't remember where I triggered onto it. It may have been that I was looking on the Internet Archive and it was over to the side column or something. Anyway, it was something in a column that I saw, grabbed it, went to it. It's like, why haven't I seen this? And then with a little bit more punching around, I found her doctorate also. So there are things that are hidden until you stumble across them, and there it was.
Yeah.
The her doctorate is it's either the doctorate or this essay is listed on the T.F. Torrance website, but I hadn't seen it there. I mean, there are things, you can have pages and pages of bibliographies of things that are going on and not see
Sure.
them. And so there it was. And so I just put this article I thought would be worthy of one day's worth at least, and then we could see if going beyond that would be something worth doing.
There's some interesting stuff in here. Thank you for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously she spent some serious time in the archives at Princeton to really
Yeah.
ask questions
Maybe.
about things that they go beyond what McGrath's intellectual history. I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Why would you not consider somebody's being formed as a missionary as part of their intellectual history?
Well, I haven't you always sort of taken that for granted? I mean,
That people
people,
wouldn't, they wouldn't include it?
I mean, oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, just from a strict historical approach, most people wouldn't think it wasn't that important that his childhood. You want to look at when he really formed his thinking when he started at university and all that,
Yeah, yeah. But that's exactly the point that I'm making is the idea that the nature of the context in which somebody's initial desire to do something to make a difference in the world is formed probably don't go away. They simply become clarified and articulated as they go along.
Yes.
So in my own story, it was in youth ministry basically that I became interested. I didn't have any intention to become an academic theologian or an author of theological books. So, I just, loved kids and loved the life that was present and what was happening there. So to say, if somebody missed out on that, if they were to write a biography of me, they would have missed out some really important pieces of the formation of
Yeah,
my theological thinking, right?
yeah,
And I think
yeah,
that's true in this essay as well, is that T.F. Torrance has been missed in terms of the depth of what is there in his theological, and even I mean we'll get to that in the end. To say his scientific interest at some level is an outworking of his missionary mind as well, right? So she could have also included that. People have made the statement. He himself said, I'm a missionary to intellectuals. I mean, he does make the statement, but
Mm.
it goes over your head so quickly that you don't really take him seriously. Kind of, it's like, oh yeah. But to say, okay, what does it really mean to be a missionary to a culture that can't see, or where Christianity is oppressed and all that? And I think that a lot of that is part of both what happened in China as well as what it meant to live in
hmm
a world where science holds the truth, so to speak, and what it means to begin thinking about how do we communicate, how do we think about the nature of the gospel as it speaks into these contexts and such. So anyway, it's expanding, how to think about Torrance and also to think about the intellectual history of people, including all of these other dimensions,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Mhm.
The
And it
question,
just the question of the Chinese background to Torrance, that what I've read so far isn't a whole lot different from the way a lot of it is in China now. When we were there, we spent a month in China in 2012, I think it was, and got to meet many of the Christians and stuff. And in a lot of ways, not much of that background has changed. It's still, you
yeah,
know, they got to kind of walk carefully and not draw a lot of attention to themselves.
yeah. I've been conversing with someone in Hong Kong, and there's a concern there about, what can be said and all that. And the
Yeah.
statement that there was a point in the 80s where there was more of an openness for theology and science conversations, but it's really gone away from that. And this person brought T.F. Torrance to Hong Kong and he lectured there, and he brought Alistair McGrath to Hong
Oh
Kong and
my.
lectured there. So to say there have been in within our lifetime, there have been times where there's been openness, and right now is not one of them.
Yeah. For sure.
So that's interesting. And yeah, the whole history of Torrance theology in Asia, because we've had people, we had just a few weeks ago Korea, and we've had the Philippines, and there's more that's there, and they're largely not connected to one another. So, part of the question
hmm
is to see what has been done and to ask the question, what can we continue to do to hear those voices and to try and build networks that become supportive in whatever way possible. And I don't know enough about how the monitoring by the government of those who have theological conversations becomes, challenging or problematic. But that's
Yeah.
something.
We knew a number of Chinese Christian students when we were in France, and I had some conversations, and I tried to be, neutral to say that, oh, this terrible government, but just asking them, and they said basically they don't say anything to anybody except whom they know. They don't put
Yeah,
stuff online. They don't, put it on a computer, nothing, because
yeah,
it'll get picked up. You
yeah.
know, you probably have people about the size of the population of the U.S. watching computers in China. That's just their job.
Right. Well, it's interesting, and I mean, I think we can expect that it will always be true that there, in different contexts, there are different resistances to the gospel. Leslie Newbegin, when coming back from India, said, I thought India had its own challenges, but I see that in the United States, there's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
whole nother level
yeah,
of challenge for the nature of the gospel. And so deep cultural mission is the phrase that I picked up from him. And at some level, I think, Torrance and Bart are attempting to really engage that deep cultural mission. And so, the language of dualism, Greco-Roman foundations, all these things are part of that, seeing the things that cover over and keep the articulation of the gospel from being heard well are all part of that learning to hear deeply in the way that Newbigin envisioned.
yeah, yeah. So
So this article by Carolyn G. Seed was a PhD. It comes from it's a small bit of what would be the larger piece. Let me see, what is the name of her doctoral? The doctorate is called The Missional Nature of Divine Human Communion, Thomas F. Torrance and the Chinese Church. And so that was submitted in May of 2016 at the POTCHEFSTROOM campus of North-West University. I don't know how you say that.
Chefstrom, South
Potchefstroom.
Africa.
Yeah, I was going to say that has to be South Africa.
Right.
It is. It is South
So,
Africa.
okay, and she mentions in her preface to that, my husband, the Reverend Dr. Richard C., has accompanied me along the academic journey. So she has a Reverend Dr. husband, which in looking a little bit, it appears that he may have died just in March of this year, if I've got the
Oh,
right
that's too bad.
Richard, so in the UK. She's also grateful to the Africa International University of Nairobi for allowing me to use their library. So
Huh.
again, there's engagement in a number of different places. Friends in London are also mentioned, working with the British Library. So, so all that to say, here's somebody who has traveled the world, been in different parts, did her doctorate in Africa, and so brings a larger context than maybe some of us would to the conversation. And so the nature of why she wrote this is because she lives in a world where questions of missional practice become important. So the focus on China, of course, is because that's where the Torrance family begins. In the introduction, just to note, scholarly research into the theology of T.F. Torrance has increased significantly in years since his death, which is 2007. Much of the research is focused on his intellectual output and scientific theology. She mentions in that first parenthesis, Hanna, 2004. So that's Martin Hanna. We had him on not too long ago. He's the Seventh-day Adventist theologian we had on. Munchin wrote, "Is Theology Scientific a study of T.F. Torrance's?" I have ordered his book. I think I found it. The lowest I found it for was $141. So
I'm
it's a
sorry.
very. But he wrote an article in the Scottish Journal of Theology, which he sent me a copy of that in the form that was being done. So we're going to actually have him on as a guest. I think it's later in January.
Munchin.
Yeah.
Munchin.
Yeah. So he's coming. So we've had the first one. We haven't yet had, but we'll have mentioned. And Yom, I have not done research on him yet. So I'm going to look for him as well. I just think it's great to be able to have conversations with these people who, do significant work, and each one of them has their own perspective that adds to the conversation. To date, she says, no significant research has been done to unite his theology and mission practice in spite of the warning of McGrath, which, of course, that's the big book by him, the one kind of extensive biography of the danger of concentrating on Torrance's intellectual achievement to the detriment of the biography that shaped his theology. So, I mean, McGrath was selective. And I mean, in a sense, this is Polanyi's whole point that even scientists decide which part of science they want to look at. So the astronomer doesn't look at microbiology.
Sure.
So to say, when we do the work of assessing the story of somebody like T.F. Torrance, to say, it would be good to at least acknowledge all the components that are part of his life to see that they all probably contributed. And in some cases, to say there may be things that they wanted to contribute to but didn't get to. And those are also worth noting that they saw something that might be possible, which both Bart and Torrance thought that there could be helpful things from onto relational thinking for the social sciences. Neither of them really developed that component. So that's one of the things I'm working at, trying to fill that piece of the puzzle out, so to speak. So yeah, and Elmer Collier, we did have on Elmer at one point. He's hard to get to come on, but he's obviously done some very significant work in providing tools for engaging um, the work of Torrance. So she just mentions that we're looking at his time in China. Well, the family in China, and particularly T.F. Torrance from 1913 as a child, 1913 to 1927. So, 100 years ago. It's so crazy to think about, the time that's passed in these things. And again, in retirement, 1984 to 1994, that these can be described as the bookends of his life. But I think the point she's going to make here and throughout is that bookends are things that there's something there and then it goes away and then in the end it comes back. That we really need to say no. It really is. It's a structural component of his whole life, and if you miss the missional piece, you won't really understand a lot of the passion that drives Torrance throughout his lifetime, in theological work, in scientific work, and again, the nature of Eastern Orthodoxy. I don't know that he had a particular mission to convert the Orthodox, but to connect with the Orthodox, I think would be a better way. That there's something that needed to be restored together. So that's part of the division that comes up. And so to say Torrance was a connector, but isn't being a connector also part of missional thinking? Right? We can
Yes.
think only conversion and not connection, but I think it's another important piece of just how we frame what is mission. Right? Nicodemus was a Pharisee who came to Jesus, and we got a very famous verse in Gospel of John because somebody that needed connection came and had a conversation with Jesus in the night. And so he wasn't entirely a pagan, but he wanted clarification that provided connection in the language of being born again. And for God so loved the world, all those things came out of that conversation. So the whole nature of what missional thinking looks like, I think we might want to, reframe and rethink that even. And I think that Torrance's work with Eastern Orthodoxy is part of that, restoring broken family lines, right? All part of the
Well,
same family, but what's that?
he did attempt to deal with Florovsky, right, with the Eucharist and
Yeah, yeah.
intercommunion, that sort of thing. But that was a lost cause. I'm sure Dragus must have told. I long to have been a fly on the wall between to hear what Dragus taught and he talked about in relation
Yeah.
to you. I
Well,
talked
Dragus
to.
is still alive, isn't he?
I think he is. I've sent him an email, but no response. I had contacted a former student of Torrance who became a priest in the Orthodox Church,
Okay.
who said, "Well, send an email to Dragus," and I did, but I never heard anything back. So
Right.
I gave up.
Well,
But
you may have given up sooner than we want you to give up. I mean, maybe the part for you. Who was it that you?
I don't remember. Someone in South Dakota that later
Okay.
was, I think, transferred to, I want to say, uh, Texas, San Antonio, but I'm not sure about that. My
Yeah.
memory fades on that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
Dragus, he was the lecturer one year at the TF Torrance annual fellowship. So
yeah.
somebody has contact with him, maybe Tom Noble or somebody, but we may be
Yeah.
able to find more powerful lines of connection and see if we can get him on for a conversation.
Wouldn't, oh, that would be outstanding. But how old would he be? I mean, could be
He
as
would be
old as I
exactly as he'd be as old as he is. I
am.
don't find
Yeah.
I don't find you to be a unworthy conversation companion at all. So I'm sure if he's as good as you, we'd be in great shape.
Yeah, but it's interesting.
So anyway, we're just laying a foundation here for, just the value of paying attention to the many parts of Torrance's life and in the context of reading through theological science to recognize this conversation is probably always in the back of T.F. Torrance's mind, right? There's a missional dimension to what he's doing in the outlying of the structure of theological science that says we have to recognize the culture we're engaging, the development of thought forms that weren't necessarily helpful to doing good theological work and really not good for humanity in many cases. So anyway, just to hear what a missionary heart does, even in theological science, is very interesting.
I think his missionary heart also was exhibited when he became a stretcher bearer during World War II.
Yeah.
Mm,
I think of that story that's often told of the young private who was dying
yeah,
and asked him, Padre, is God really like Jesus?
yeah. Well, this is a
Good.
whole nother book that could be written, right? It's T.F. Torrance, the on the battlefield.
Yeah,
Because there are probably letters and other things that somebody could read
on
through and
earth.
think about what it is that he was thinking and saying that would be very pertinent to our world right now, which is dealing with warfare and battles and
Hmm.
how to think about them. So,
So, what sort of credentials does one need to unearth the manuscripts at Princeton? I mean, to go in and take a look, what do you need? Some kind of I testify I'm writing a book and I need to research, or what is that like? You
I don't
can,
remember being asked those questions when I went there. I just went and said, I'd like to look in the TF Torrance collection. Here are the boxes that I think you can get a sense of what's in the boxes. And
yeah,
so you can go through and look and see, periods of time or whatever might be there. But I don't remember that there was a criteria that you had to get past a paywall, so to speak, to be able to go in. And there was no cost. I think they're held at Princeton because Ian brought them there. But the nature of the use of Princeton materials is, I don't think anything at Princeton is kind of off limits to anybody who's doing anything of any work. I mean, if you said I'm writing an article, I would think they'd say fine. If you say I'm writing a book,
I could say I know Marty Folsom.
that could do it for you. That yeah. We can find out. We can find out what it is that it takes to get through there because yeah,
Yeah.
it's an important question. The
Still Transinger.
when I was there, I took some pictures of a sermon of T.F. Torrance's, right? Because I wanted to be able to see the text. And as I was leaving, the person who was at the front desk there says, "Now you didn't take any pictures or anything, did you?" And I said, "Well, yeah. Well, you've got to erase those. Ian doesn't want anything to be taken out in that mode. You can refer to it, you can take notes on it, but you can't actually copy anything." So that was the only limitations that I saw. Go with a notebook and ready to take notes, but that the material is all open for reading. And I think Mike Hobbit spent some serious time there too, and he could give you insight if there are any limitations on what it is that you could do to get in. But I don't think that would be a problem for you.
I'm writing a book.
That would do. And the other person, Ken Ross, is he's at Princeton a fair amount, and he is person who deals with the whole world of archiving and all that. So I think he would know what limitations that there could be
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah. Well, so I guess Nick Mayo's out of luck when he's looking for a high resolution photograph of the icon of Athanasius.
Well,
And
somebody has the book. He's got a picture of it there, right? So it's like
well,
create a high resolution picture of a picture that's there. Shouldn't be too difficult.
he says it's in the hard. Well, I don't want to get off on that too much, but he
Yeah,
says it's in the hardbound copy of Trinitarian. What is it? Trinitarian life or
is it
Trinitarian faith?
Trinitarian faith?
Is it?
Yeah, I don't have that edition, so I don't have that picture.
I I look. I I don't know. I don't know. I'm surprised that it's. I looked for it also online and
Yeah,
couldn't find anything like
lots
that.
lots of pictures of Athanasius. He got his picture taken a lot, but
Yeah, yeah. I've got an icon I can load him of
yeah,
Athanasius. Yeah. I'll
yeah.
take a pic in it. So
So anyway, yeah,
you know,
we'll see if we can find somebody who has the book. I think to get a high resolution image of it should not be impossible.
well, I think he was thinking of where is the icon? Is it at
The
Princeton?
original,
Yeah,
uh,
where I think he's thinking of a high res photo of the icon,
of the icon, yes.
but maybe
So he
not.
wants
Maybe
he wants an icon of the icon of the icon.
Yeah.
I don't know. You
If
know,
you need, if
Nick
you
Because
is a
need
Jesus
a,
professional.
is the icon of God.
yeah.
And
Nick,
anyway,
prior to his current life, Nick was a professional photographer,
okay,
so he knows about high resolution and
right. Okay.
yeah.
If you need an iconographer, I know one in France I can put you in contact with. So
He could probably take that one and make one from it.
yeah.
Anyway, this article is really interesting, Torrance.
It's
Sure is.
actually wonderful.
I can't wait to get into it.
Okay, good. So anyway, the language of Missio Dei, which is, the mission of God, has been of interest in the past few decades. I went to actually a BART conference. They talked about BART and the language of Missio Dei, suggesting that BART may have the one who actually began kind of the use of it. There was some debate over that. John Flett, who did his PhD at Princeton, wrote on BART and the Missio Dei. It's been picked up by a number of people since, but to say Torrance certainly lived within what it was that Bart was doing, that God has a mission, we don't have a mission. And so the nature of what we do is we participate in God's mission. And so the whole question about the mission to the unchurched as well as the church is certainly worthy to be asked. But to say Torrance himself was raised with a father who went to a faraway country. I've been to China once, and it didn't seem like a place that was particularly friendly to the gospel. And as we've talked about, it's certainly no friendlier today. So to say the nature of studying persons, I'm a family systems is my dominant motif, which is to say every person has a whole network of relationships that are all formative for who we become, which is another way of talking about onto-relational.
Mm.
To talk about a person, you have to talk about, their family of origin, the person they marry, their family, the kids that you have. All of those are part of the broader sense of the onto relation of a person. And so to go to China and to be there is to be in a place where your relations with those people, whether you speak their language or not, would be one thing. And the question of they're in China, but what language do they speak in China? Right? Because China doesn't have a single language. And
No.
that was one of the things that was interesting for me in the reading of this article is that the Han people are the majority group of people. We know about the Uyghurs recently, which are the Muslim. Um, the I'm trying to think of all the languages that I know are there in China. My stepson speaks Mandarin, but so Mandarin is a dominant one. But what's the other major one that is there?
Well, there's Cantonese for Hong Kong in
Cantonese.
that area. And then
Okay.
but even within that, there's two or three subdivisions. conversations that they actually can't really understand each other.
Yeah.
We have a couple of friends from Hong Kong that went through it, and that's why I don't
Yeah.
have any hair.
My my stepson said there will never be a problem of the Chinese army becoming able to become, a single huge fighting force because within any unit there will be so many languages that they won't even
Right.
have the ability, in a sense, to converse within themselves. So it's quite a thought just to think that languages within a country can be so disconnected in a sense that you can't communicate in a sense. So it's a country of many languages. The question of what language was in the area where the Torrances were, which again, you think China, so you think all of China, right? But it's like, so where did
Yeah.
Torrance Senior go? It wasn't China general. It was a very specific people. And again, the nature of in this article, QIANG. And how do you say that?
The Q is kind of pronounced at SH, hard SH sound. Chiang, something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So in her doctorate, I read that originally it had been a CH something, but the current use of it is this spelling. So she went with the current use that
Yeah.
is being.
Yeah. All right.
But if you're doing research, you would need to recognize that even the name of this people, you'd have to learn, what was it spelled at the
Right.
time Torrance was there and it was being written.
But Torrance Senior spoke fluent Chinese or whatever particular Chinese dialect was in the area. I think I read that in the interview with David
Yeah. Um,
Torrance.
but
They
and then it raised just the question, what area was he in and what dialect would it have been and how many other dialects would he know to be able to converse with the government, for example? And
Well, it
so
was probably more in the southern part of China, um, um, which was part of the area that we visited. I can never remember the name of the city, but it's where during the Second World War, the air caravan that flew over the Himalayas and landed in China, that was kind of the center of evangelism up until the rise of Mao. And
uh,
that's where Hudson had Taylor's churches there and that kind of thing. So, and
flying the
that is a different dialect completely. So,
yeah. So anyway, just to recognize the nature of language barriers is something that we may not think about. The nature of right now, West Coast, East Coast, the South, the very same words can bring up all kinds of different implications they're not outside of the scope of what's open here. To be missional, one has to ask, who are these people? Where are they geographically located? What are the languages that would be used to communicate to them? All of those things have to, at some level, be taken into consideration. And the nature of science, I mean, as we read through theological science, it becomes obvious that not everybody uses the language of scientific conversation or Torrance's special use of things like katafusan. I don't know that you could use that with many biologists or doctors or anything and have them understand what you're meaning. So to say the nature of mission requires a recognition of language issues that are there. And so both the senior Torrance as well as TF Torrance would have had to have worked at learning language as part of the process of what's going on. And as is stated in the article at one point, TF Torrance had 50 million Bibles that would have been in some dialect. It didn't say, I don't think, of Chinese, was part of him feeling like he had fulfilled his father's mission. But the question is there just one Chinese Bible?
Hmm.
officially, yeah, it's the
Officially,
one
yeah.
that's the new Chinese Union version is the official, but there are a lot of backdoor press
Yeah.
versions of it. But
Yeah. And would they have been in the dialect of the place that T.F. Torrance went to?
I think it probably would have been. Yeah,
Okay.
it's
So
hard to.
anyway, yeah, these are just part of the questions that, something gets awakened as you begin to read about the challenges of being a missionary, to say probably we have a lot of the same challenges, but may not even notice it. To ask the question of a Gen X, Gen Z, baby boomer, do they all speak the same language? What is it? What are the language that we use? And within the congregations that you work with, Howard, are there generational differences where the younger folk would not kind of speak the same language as the
Oh,
older?
definitely. I mean, the first purge happened when the Khmer Rouge came in. They took out all the honorifics. Cambodian is just loaded with them. I mean, you have to use a certain word for a certain age group, otherwise you're an idiot, So,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then when the Khmer Rouge got kicked out, they started bringing back some of the honorifics, but by and large, they're mostly gone now.
yeah. Yeah. So this biography is based large, at least it begins being based primarily on letters. So I mean that's one of the things, the work of doing that and going through all the letters in the Princeton collection, and to get these quotes that bring the developing sense of Torrance Senior as well as T.F. Torrance, and the conversations that would be there. That's a lot of work to do, and it starts to give us insight as to kind of the nuances of the heart that T.F. Torrance ultimately had. In the On the first page in the missional biography, um, this is not to propose that Torrance's biography should be seen as the source of his theology, but an approach that would run counter to Torrance's conviction regarding the objective nature of truth. So, the whole nature of how truth is presented. Rather, the purpose is to highlight the distinctive missional nature of Torrance's theology of divine human communion, and to suggest historical, biographical, as well as theological reasons for this emphasis. And there is interaction with other missiologists here, and just the whole nature of the embeddedness of doing theological work in different contexts and the worldviews that are part of them. So just locating T.F. Torrance, then to say he was in China, but not China general, it was kind of specific. And on the second page, the mission history of T.F. Torrance begins with his parents. And so to say T.F. Torrance was shaped with parents that affirmed mission work. A lot of people leave their parents, and their parents dismay that they would go off to do it. So the sense of something that's generational with a heart for missions is significant. Their influence on missional and theological development of their family provides an early 20th century missionary movement context for the development of Torrance's persona. So the question, what was the 20th century missionary movement? I think we have lots of ideas about where did missions work and where did they not work. Where was it just transporting in Western thoughts, and where was it really effective at learning to bring the gospel that was not just damaging the people who were there, but was actually bringing the gospel in their language, so to speak. Um, this era of mission history, together with the primary sources from which it's derived, belongs to what Knoll calls the pre-modern period. So pre-modern means there's the pre-modern, the modern, and his mission's gone to a postmodern. We know that the world has postmodern thinking, but is there a postmodern mission movement? This is a question that popped into my head there. Once we start reading through the lenses of the development of assessing these epochs of time. So the story for Torrance Sr. begins in a pre-modern period. The whole question of what that means is not entirely clear there. The nature of the word evangelical bias brings up in my head, a missionary comes in, they preach the gospel, they have meetings, they find somebody to translate, but it's a lot of probably Western thoughts without a lot of translation of thoughts that is brought in, and hoping, and people obviously respond to that for a variety of reasons. but what really happens to the community and what happens if the missionary leaves. There are some who are just evangelists that come in and then leave, and then there are those who create something that is more long term. So the nature of the stories that goes on is that T.F. Torrance seemed to have a long term commitment to this specific people, which would say there was a desire to know the culture, to learn their language, to build buildings, and for T.F. Torrance, beyond his father, to do education. Right. So for Torrance, part of missional thinking is you have to educate the people. It's what we often think. It's great to be baptized, but let's also have some good development of theology and a life lived within the church, so that it's not just an event that doesn't have a carrying on implication. Um, it seems as though that sense of education has a sense of Torrance's desire for the longevity of the life of faith in those who become Christians. But that's all just reading in from my naive, at some level, naive image of what goes on there. I have not taken a lot of courses in world missions. Mostly it's come up in the context of courses in church history, which tend to do a lot with American church history, some with European church history, not so much in the Far East, and not even that much in Africa, other than you hear about a missionary going from the United States and doing something there. But to really hear how the story plays out is not a lot there. And I know Leslie Newbigin went to India. Do I know what Leslie Newbigin was able to accomplish in India? No, I really don't. I don't know what he left there. I know when he came back, that's when a lot of people were really impacted by Leslie Newbigin's work on Newbigin's return to the States, because he gained eyes to see what missions can look like. Then when he came back to the United States, it's like, whoa, we need more here than we did in India. The challenge of the gospel is huge here. So, and I wonder to what degree that was also true for T.F. Torrance, that there was something about mission to the West that was as challenging or more challenging than in China in the specific parts. So she goes on then to talk about the Torrance family in China, 1895 to 1934, which is, right up to the time of the Great Depression in the United States. But how did the Great Depression do in the UK?
It hit there. It happened. It actually started in Austria, kind of swung over to the U.S. and then back up to Europe. And
Okay.
Germany obviously got hit a little sooner because the economy was bad to begin with. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So the from the late 1800s through the 1834, it's a time in world history that we get glimpses of it. You hear about the Spanish flu, and which was apparently as bad as what we just went through with COVID. But I don't think I heard about it until COVID came along, and it's like, oh yeah,
yeah.
back then they had it. Then it's like, oh well, did they learn anything about it? Well, I think so, but we have to go dig
Well,
out the books.
it got lost. My grandfather, who was a draft dodger in World War I, went to Iowa to pick corn, and he would approach towns to go in, and there were people with shotguns and rifles outside keeping people out. They wouldn't let
Wow.
anybody into the town unless they knew them. So
Yeah. Yeah. So all that to say, the time that the Torrances are in China, the rest of the world wasn't all at peace. There were major things that were going along and having to learn how to deal with those. But so Thomas Torrance Sr., which the author here, Carolyn Seed, will just go from here on, she just calls it Torrance Sr., which is speaking of the father. So born in Scotland to a farming family, committed members of the Church of Scotland. And again, early on in life, felt called to engage in evangelistic mission overseas. So again, the whole question of where that came from, how they thought about what missions was, these are all things that are unpacked at little bits and snips and pieces as we go through here. Um, T.F. Torrance recalls the impact that his father's letter had on him when he was shown a copy. I often think of the letter that you let me read, that letter that you sent to your mother and father informing them of your call to the mission field. So again, this is for the manuscript collection. Um, so this was a letter, I'm just backing up a little. Torrance Sr. defied his parents' wishes and wrote them a letter explaining the priority of his call. So again, there's something about the conviction of Torrance Sr. that seems to have left a lasting imprint on T.F. Torrance's life, the commitments to missions, that he himself took up that call as well throughout the whole of his life.
Just
Go ahead.
not to barge in, but I just noticed on page 3 of 10, the right-hand column, the first individual paragraph, it says one of the difficulties Torrance Sr. had was an understanding of the Chang religion. So he didn't speak it, but there was a young man who came in to help him. I just noticed that. I don't know.
Yeah. And the rest of that sentence, and his inability to speak their dialect. So
yeah.
Right.
Well,
so again,
wait. You said his inability?
Right.
Yep.
He couldn't
It's
speak.
interesting. It's interesting. Did you read? We're talking about the Speaking Chinese by Torrance Sr.
Yeah.
Well, did you read what his son David said of that? About his father was very fluent in Chinese.
Probably later on, he probably became fluent. So this is probably in the early part. So in 1920, the senior collected materials to publish an article. Let's see.
That's right. After he came home is when David was talking about his fluency. Quoting him, he said to me, this Chinese man who came to visit him said to me, he could not get over my father. He said, when his back was turned, you could not know that he was not Chinese. He had remarkable knowledge. He became.
But it may not have been this Chang dialect, though.
Yeah. Well, that's true. That's true. It was the one that came to visited by a Chinese tutor. If he would have a meal at his home, his parents had come over and fled from communist China. So it doesn't say anything except to say he was a Chinese tutor. Huh. Interesting.
I'm going to back up a little bit just to the earlier part. It seems as though in 1895, Tom Sr. joined the China Inland Mission. It doesn't say anything at that point about language learning. Was sent on an evangelistic, or as an evangelist to the Chengdu in Sichuan province. And so the CIM, the China Inland Mission, was atypical of missions in the late 19th century. It aimed to evangelize the whole of China through preaching of the gospel without setting up educational institutions, which, again, I would think that would include language and other things as well. So there's some pieces that are missing, and it raises questions about how we think about missions, and the longevity is what seems to be missing for T.F. Torrance. If you don't have educational institutions, then you create events, but you're not creating a culture that really knows and sustains the gospel kind of life that would be there. So although he was a committed evangelist, Torrance Sr. found his policies in conflict with those of the China Inland Mission, as he believed strongly in theological training for converts. So, here's a philosophy difference of how you do missions. One of them, seems to be more just get out there, preach the gospel, and the other says we need to train leadership to sustain and extend the nature of what's going on. And there was ultimately a fallout with the leadership, and Torrance Sr. returned to Scotland in 1909. Now, at this point, there's nothing in here about what he knew in terms of language. So at this point, it's conflict within the organization that's sending. the conflict is not within
Huh.
engaging Chinese issues. So then in 1910, he attends the Edinburgh Mission Conference, which is a pretty big deal. He was taken up in the American Bible Society to go in and do work in Sichuan province. So to do something for the American Bible Society, that seems like language is now becoming an important piece. He marries Annie. Go ahead.
I can't imagine a missionary outfit that doesn't train converts. That just doesn't. That's weird. I mean, isn't it? I mean, what?
It's
It's
weird to
almost
us now.
well. Martin
It's
Davis is training pastors
yeah,
in Kenya and Uganda, and I can understand. Well, good for Torrance Senior for bailing. I mean, my goodness.
yeah. Well, these are the things, it's hard to go back and recognize the challenges early on, get out there, preach the gospel and all that. You might have an evangelistic movement that wants to do that, but they're not thinking about, well, what language do they speak?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
how do you sustain it? I mean, these are all important questions that, possibly we're missing. But then there are others. The American Bible Society, I think, still continues on, and maybe it's because they recognize these other dimensions. And to say the work of theology and science today, maybe that's still one of Torrance's contribution to say we need to learn to speak a language that people speak today and speak it better than them, to think scientifically, but not to have the dualisms and things that get lost. So I think we still need to be thinking through these issues as well. Did you want to say something, Howard?
Yeah, I just if something really off the wall. I was trying to find the background and I Googled Tom Torrance Sr. And there was this article that says that there was some reverend named Thomas Torrance who thought that Jang were monotheists and descendants of Israelites.
You're going to see that in the article. It actually shows up in here.
Oh, does it? Oh,
Absolutely.
Yes,
yeah.
It's a major piece.
it is a major
Yeah.
piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I didn't, I haven't got that far, but I just,
No,
It,
like I
yeah,
said, but
it
I
it
suppose if
threw
he
me
did
back too.
learn,
The lost tribe of Israel, one of the lost
yeah,
tribes.
yeah, that was very prominent at the turn of the century, that and British Israelism and all this other stuff.
That's right.
But
Right. And
but this
also,
leads me to think that he probably did become proficient in the Chang dialect.
I think
And
he probably did. I think you're right. But it didn't begin there. And the question about TF Torrance is, as well, to what degree did each of them learn, within the family system? This is where family, where you can learn the language together and nurture that, is more
mhm.
significant than an individual maybe who goes. So again, in the right hand column on page 2 of 10, um, the early life of T.F. Torrance and his five siblings, born between 1912 and 1924, which 1924 again is exactly 100 years ago. So the um,
wow,
the last one there is David Torrance. Did he turn 100?
he's the
Yeah,
young one,
yeah,
youngest.
he's the young one. So he just turned 100. So we're literally looking at 1924, and it's like, well, that's David. Um,
Yeah.
was characterized by assimilation into Chinese culture. Now,
Yeah.
that one sentence there, we could take a whole book probably on that. What was the culture? What did it
Hmm.
mean to attempt to assimilate without losing distinctive Christian character as well? I mean, these are just really important questions. They lived in the Chinese area of the city, spoke the local dialects, and interacted with Chinese people, although they attended the Canadian mission school, which probably spoke English. So again,
Canadian.
yeah, their first language may have been English and then French, depending upon what the Canadians were teaching. And then the question of what they were doing in terms of the dialects of Chinese in their work. So on the grounds of West China Union University in Chengdu. Now, do you know where Chengdu is, Howard?
Um, Yeah, it's down toward the south. I can't
Yeah.
think of any specific way
Well,
to
it's
do
in
it.
the province. That's not the province that it's in. It's in what's the name of the province? Xinguan, Sichuan
Um,
province. It
Sichuan?
mentioned. I didn't have time to look it up
It's a
either.
few lines down. That's okay. That's okay. So Torrance has vivid memories of passing the Chengdu
Yeah,
leper colony on his way to school every day, and
this.
all the
oh,
bodily.
yeah. Yeah, it's in the Sichuan province, which is kind of south and a little bit to the west, as I remember.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that part you were reading there, Marty, is important, isn't it?
Well,
That part.
it's the formation of experiential thoughts. You see people and colonies of people who are um, have leprosy, and I mean, it's almost like living in the New Testament there, but right with lepers
Yeah,
and
I
all
mean,
those things.
remember Torrance, and I think it's mentioned here that Torrance references this in his book, or in Robert Walker's assimilation of his lectures, and
Yeah.
in the book of Moment, this leper colony, this
Hmm.
impression. He mentions this again. It's
You
important.
remember the impression he talks about there?
Yeah, it's in this. It's you mean where?
No, just what impression it made on Torrance that Bob Walker.
Oh, well, I think if I recall, I just read it earlier today. It's he's talking about the deformed limbs and facial features, and likens that to our humanity. That
Yeah.
Jesus comes to change and to what's the word I'm looking at? Transform,
Yeah.
cleanse, sanctify,
Make
all the
whole.
above.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to say in the world that we live in right now, we've talked about loneliness and despair goes along with that, and all these other things that are part of our modern sense. But I don't know, we don't have the same eyes to see
Right.
um, unless there's suicide or abuse or violence, which we that's around us as well too. But there are different things I think that are part of our contemporary sense of what does it look like in the place that we live to see what Torrance saw there in China, for us to have eyes to see the breakdown of humanity that the gospel wants to address. The nature of warlords is mentioned in that too. So, there was if you have warlords, it's not safe, right? So he was living in a place where there was unrest, violence, um, and it says during which foreigners had to flee into the safety of mission compounds when these warlords got out of hand. So anyway, um, it's easy to think it's easy to just not know what it must have been to live in that context, how unsafe, the language breakdown, how discouraged one might get there. But from that all, you get the tenaciousness of Thomas Sr. and T.F. Torrance to see a work done there. And that is part of the formation of their character, the commitment to the gospel, which in the next paragraph, the word um, zealous evangelical mission. The Torrance children were brought up in the atmosphere of zealous evangelical mission. So to say, when we talk about T.F. Torrance and sometimes him getting a bit snippy from the front when dealing with students who are being silly, you could see where somebody who grew up and was really shaped in the forge of these challenging parts of China would not suffer fools lightly, so to speak, in the classroom who they didn't maybe have the depth that he would have had, and so to see the forging in the context he was, I think helps us to understand more of who he was. In the bottom, well, the next to the bottom paragraph of that right hand column, I was interested. Their mother was equally influential, teaching them to read the Word of God in such a way as to expect to hear God speak to them through it. So this is something that there's no date on it, but it was something that comes out there, which in my own work, I'm trying to, move beyond just talking about God, but to believe that God speaks to us. It's Karl Barth's God Speaks. And, to say whenever we just speak about God, God is one step removed. But Torrance's mother was trying to help them to learn to hear God speak through the Bible. And I think it's an easily read over and missed the dimension of what that would mean. And when Torrance says, I always in my whole life believed that God was, very real and present, that being taught by his mother to learn to hear God speak through the Bible is one of those things that I think it takes you into a whole nother dimension of relationship.
It reminds me of the conversations or the things that Charles and John Wesley shared about their mother, the influence that she had on them, and how it affected their later ministry.
Right, right. Yeah. So the whole nature of what we might call a scientific mindset is largely we observe through science. That's kind of what's science? Well, science is observing and studying, which for Torrance, of course, the whole sense of hearing, not just seeing or observing, that is the Newtonian modern mindset is observing, but that biblical science, theological science requires a hearing of the other. And I hear that intuition coming from his mother. A proper science of the personal requires we hear the other who speaks, and only then can we kata fusen, understand the other who speaks.
The audible light.
The audible light. Exactly. So just moving then on to the next page, the mission to, and I'm trying to remember how you said it properly. Kayang, is that right?
Cheng.
Cheng. So mission Cheng. So anyway, there's this particular area, Cheng, which is going to become really the focus of the life of the mission in China. So to say he went to China, there was a very specific, and it was something that was a minority kind of place. So it wasn't going to the majority. It was going to one of the smaller places. So one aspect of Torrance Sr.'s work in China in particular was to have a significant impact on his eldest son. This was the evangelistic work among the Qing minority group whom Torrance Sr. had first encountered briefly in 1917 on a mission trip into the upper Min River Valley in the area bordering on Tibet. So over by Tibet, up a valley, and you start to get a very localized feel, right? For me, it was a focusing in that the Torrances didn't just go to all of China, which is a huge area. They went to a particular place. It's what becomes the particularity of Torrance's theology and Barth, to not just deal with generalities, but the particularity of going to a particular place, a people, learning their language. And on his first trip, Torrance Sr. found an inscription dating the Qing back to King Yu of the Hissa dynasty, 2205, 22,005 years BCE. So that's before Christ. So that's very old. He observed that they were distinct from the Han Chinese, which is the minority group in China, and had often come under attack as outsiders. So you start almost to get, Jesus and the Samaritans. The Samaritans are the outcast ones. So to say Torrance Sr. went to the Samaritans, the minority group who were up in the hills and not particularly accepted, that's who he went to. It's playing out the flavor of who he was. As a result, they've withdrawn to live in inaccessible villages with stone watchtowers, taking careful notes on their belief system and collecting artifacts. He returned each year to preach the gospel and research their religion. So he was doing research. He was doing that katafusen work. I mean, the word research there, he was learning who they were, what their story was, what they had come to believe. In his teenage years, T.F. Torrance accompanied his father and participated in the mission work It was to engender in him a passionate sense of call to become a missionary. So it's in these visits with his father to these places that something was ignited in him. In a letter in 1985, Torrance recalls, I have always wanted to be a missionary on the Tibetan border of Sichuan in the upper Min Valley, where my father had worked so long. So it's that whole thing of the value of trips to places and meeting the people and seeing the needs. I think there's something of the particularity of all that that is important, that missions isn't just a concept. It's a particular seeing and meeting and knowing and coming to value a people. Torrance made no secret in his desire, even as a teenager. In a letter to Torrance Sr., he wrote to ask if T.F. Torrance, this person wrote, T.E. Plowman wrote asking if T.F. Torrance would return to work among these people. He clearly expected Torrance to fulfill his declared intention. But Torrance ultimately goes on here, goes back to Edinburgh, goes back to Scotland, and does his own work of becoming, in a sense, the theologian that he became, but never, in a sense, leaving what's going on here. And the years didn't get any easier for Torrance Sr. And so he talks about, this is in these paragraphs here, he talks about what you were mentioning, Howard, that Thomas Sr. Began to propose a theory about these people being descendant from the Israelites, with 12 banners of memory, with 12 sons of their ancestors, which he, Thomas Sr., identified as Jacob. Anyway, it goes on with all these things, which at the conclusion of this article is going to say pretty much that's been discredited. And yet Thomas held to something of and I'm not sure I fully grasped what TF still held on, a parallel that he saw as to the nature of the gospel that goes out and works through ways that are not the ways that we would think, and yet God is still at work, I guess is the closest I kind of get to maybe what it is that he was saying. In the paragraph that begins after the explanation on the right hand column, Thomas Sr. read to the priest the book of Leviticus. Torrance recalls, when Father read the Levitical instructions of the Old Testament, the priest jumped off his bench and said, those are the lost scriptures which had been represented by the white scroll. Torrance Sr. then read from John's Gospel, explained that while the Qing were in China, the sin bearer had come in the person of Jesus Christ. Torrance recalls, the Ora priest believed the good news of the gospel, which my father proclaimed to him. He and his sons were baptized. That is an experience I shall never forget. So there is this sense of the discovery by these people who is reading biblical texts that, whether it was the actuality of those things or not, there was something that fulfilled what had been a desire on the part of these people to have a religious connection, that what Thomas Sr. was giving them gave them something that they accepted as being true.
There was some DNA testing involved.
There was some DNA testing, but it wasn't quite conclusive, was it?
No, let's see.
As it goes on here,
page 5.
Uh-huh.
The only scientific proof regarding their origins is DNA evidence showing that De Chang migrated from Eurasia during the Bronze Age.
Okay.
This leaves the possibility of migration from the Middle East in the pre-Mosaic period open to further research.
Yeah. So that's not a conclusive. It says maybe there's more there to look at.
Right. It's interesting, isn't it?
It is
Speaking as one who comes from a background of a lost tribe of Israel.
Yeah.
British Israel.
British.
I don't know if you've heard of this. Our Chinese friend did a lot of research on it, and she was convinced it was true. But there's the Chinese word for boat is actually made up of characters that say 8 persons and a boat. And there's all this other strands of tradition and history that says this is talking about Noah.
Yeah,
And it's interesting, but I'm a little hesitant.
yeah. Hesitance fine. I mean, at this point, we're just taking note of things that happened in the history that became formative for T.F. Torrance. His father believed that he had found something that was connected, and it gave him a further desire to bring the gospel, in a sense, to complete their story. And I'd say at some level, the gospel completes their story no matter where they came from.
Right.
And so we don't have to read in these other things necessarily to get the conclusion that they got. So as it goes on, things got tough. They had to flee the country. Bibles were destroyed. One Bible was buried, which later is brought back by T.F. Torrance, I believe, and is called the Resurrected Bible because it had been buried and then brought out. But it was the only one that survived of those years. The
What?
church buildings that they had built were either taken over for other things. So anyway, the work was largely stymied that had been laid by Torrance Sr. Um, I'm on page 4 now at the bottom. Just Torrance returning to Scotland, meets with Hugh Ross McIntosh, and begin to understand the integral nature of theology and mission. Now, I've never heard Hugh Ross McIntosh with the word mission put in there. I'd only ever heard theology. So that now is something that needs to be explored a bit more too. What was the dimension that McIntosh would have played in mission? And McIntosh's teachings deepen the call to return to China as a missionary. And I've heard none of that before. So yeah, also to the desire to engage in theological education as mission. So that
That's
education is mission. Was that
inbox 10 at
it's in box
Princeton.
10. Yeah.
Yeah,
So this whole
amazing.
theological education becomes obviously a major part of Torrance's life, and to say it's merely an extension of his mission orientation that we always say McIntosh's theology, but we don't talk about McIntosh's missionary move, and the two of them probably should be held together. So it's just enriching for us that perspective of what's going on. At the top of the next column, when Torrance eventually decided in 36, 37 to turn his call to mission in China to do pastoral work and theological education, he did not feel that he had been disobedient. He comments, even as a professor of theology, I've always tried to be a missionary. So again, just to see that the language of what he's doing, whether it's on the mission field or in the classroom or in the church, it's all from the core at some level being a missionary, which I think that's a helpful thing to get at there. The last sentence in that paragraph, Torrance's participation in theological education in Scotland and beyond gave him a platform for engagement in theology as mission until there was an opportunity to return to China.
Yeah, that sentence, that right a few sentences above that says Torrance never lost his sense of call to mission among the Chang. It was
Yeah,
focused in another direction, focused in
yeah,
another direction.
yeah,
Mission to theologians and academics, right?
yeah.
And
And I think
pastors.
pastors and yeah, and you and I, right?
Yes, right.
I mean, to say we are at some level, we are the fruit of that
And
mission.
now, and now in Kenya and Uganda, and
Yeah. So the resurrection of the Chung Church, 1984 to 94. With the end of the revolution, some things were possible to happen. He learned that the Christians had no Bibles, and the church buildings had been uh, requisitioned as libraries. After a brief initial visit, Torrance returned to Scotland with a threefold objective: ensure the Chinese Christians had access to the Bible again, to enable the Chung Church to repossess church buildings and to prepare for the future of the church leadership of the church by supporting theological education in the region. So, these are things that, in some level, he did something on all of those fronts. In
Notice
1986, but
also he republished his father's book.
yes,
Do you have a copy of his father's
I
book?
don't have a copy of that book.
That would be interesting. See that?
Yeah,
I wonder if that's out there somewhere.
yeah, you can
Probably in
research that for us, and
probably in Princeton somewhere.
probably, yeah, it's probably somewhere. Maybe one at
Oh,
the Vatican.
it's republished in 1988.
Huh,
Jewish
interesting.
publisher from Chicago, Daniel Shaw.
Huh. Okay. Well, we might
So,
have to look at that at some point.
yeah.
So, by the time of Torrance's death in 2007, 50 million Bibles have been printed in China. This is undoubtedly Torrance's greatest mission achievement, and one that he felt satisfied with because it gave him the opportunity to realize his call to continue his father's work in China. So, to recognize the many ways that completing the call, so to speak, can happen is significant. In 1986, Torrance returned to Chengdu in order to assist in the reestablishment of the churches there. At the time, he was accompanied by Israeli anthropologists. So they were doing research on the thesis that his father had. Torrance handed over the title deeds that had been his father's possession to the local authorities in the hope the government would pay rent for the confiscated property. At the same time, he gave the resurrected Bible, that was the one that had been buried, to one of the leaders there. In order to secure the future of the church, he instructed Tai Qing to identify a suitable person for theological training. He also visited the Chengdu Theological Seminary and obtained assurances they would train a pastor from these people. So anyway, there's lots of the story of, oh, well, is that theological seminary still there? What happened to that Bible? And I mean, there's all kinds of interesting questions from that. In the small print, in the years between 86 and his last visit in 1994, Torrance engaged in correspondence with many Christian people. Where are all those letters? Whom he had met during the trips, most notably student teachers from the Abba Teachers College in the Qing region, which he gave a lecture on scientific theology of light in 1986. And where's that lecture? There, I mean, it probably exists somewhere. The odds are fair.
Box 162.
It may be in Box 162.
What they
In
say.
1994, he made his final trip in order to encourage his converts and facilitate the rebuilding of the church that had run into bureaucratic difficulties. And later down, he continued to support the Chengdu Seminary and hoped that the Qing and other minority pastors would be trained there. So again, he wasn't aiming for everybody. He had a very specific group that he felt committed to, and it sounds like it did not get easier for them. I don't know what the state of those people is today. Are they still, an identifiable group there in China? That one,
Yeah.
they are.
Yeah, they're part of the Sichuan province, and
Yeah.
they've probably been assimilated a lot into the Han, the dominant culture. But there has been some efforts the last 10, 20 years on the Chinese government to try to help them restore some of their culture. But they've, from what I've heard, they've always kind of considered the Chang kind of the hillbillies, or they were a lesser people, and you had to work hard to get them to where everybody else was. So
yeah. Good. On the right-hand column of page 5, the paragraph begins, nonetheless, the lack of scientific proof did not deter Torrance from his resolve to continue the evangelization of the Qing begun by his father. The significance of the mission of Israel had been imprinted on the young Torrance, which again, you hear this in both TF as well as David. His theological studies had further convinced him of the significance of Israel's history in the mission purposes of God. So again, to say the interest that Torrance has in Israel partly comes from his father's curiosity as their connection between these people and Israel. It's beyond just reading the Bible itself. So that's quite interesting. From his understanding the priestly mission of Israel to the nations, Torrance built a biblical and systematic theology of the Messiah Day through the covenant, encompassing both Israel and the Church of Christ, realized in and through the incarnation. Mission to the Cheng is therefore the initial point at which Torrance's theology of the missional nature of the divine human communion and his personal mission practice intersect. In other words, not in the Bible, but in this the issues raised when in China with these people, are they the one through whom or who God early on established a covenant 2,000 years before Christ? So anyway, that's the author of this article is saying that Torrance's interests begin with his father's interest in the Israel connection through this people in China, not through the reading of the Bible. Does that make sense? You have a confused look, Bill.
Well, I just, it's only because I suffer confusion from time to time.
Good. Well, as long as it's from time to time, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Start a club and get T-shirts.
Yeah, I was actually trying to do two things at once: listen to you and also to read about the current state of the Chang as polytheistic and shamanistic.
Yeah,
currently.
which it says later in the article here as well.
So I apologize, but I was not listening
That's okay.
as closely as I should.
That's okay. Sorry to call you out on
Because
that.
you said something earlier that I said, well, didn't I read their current situation or current as to when this
Yeah.
was written?
Yeah.
Polytheistic and shamanistic. That's
Yeah.
quite a stretch from one of the lost tribes.
It is quite a stretch, but that happens. I mean, look at the United States. You know, whatever influence they had as Christians early on, the form of Christianity that's developing is diverse, with very diverse opinions about who God is, who Jesus is, what it means to be Christian. You know, and that's just in 200 years. We've got this plethora of people identifying with Jesus and yet sometimes unrecognizable.
True.
So at the bottom then of 5, the major section there, the missional nature of divine human communion in Torrance's theology. So he goes on to just build an argument here. The whole sense of she builds the argument, the whole sense of the God who covenants, the God who has a purpose in speaking to, of setting forth the gospel, bringing it in the mystery that comes through faith, grace, hypostatic union, condescension, substitution. All of these themes have missional implications, is what she's saying. So it's easy to think of them just reading the early church fathers and not think of them as essential parts of the nature of the missional work of God. And I think that's what she's trying to get, is that Torrance in these things is not just trying to interpret the early church fathers, but trying to ask, what does it mean to be a missionary, and how is God a missionary, and how do we see them through that lens, and not just put them in great councils of the church, but put them on the front line of how do we bring the gospel in person to the people who God wants to address. And that's what I heard her saying in this section. Going on over to page 7, the nature of communion and Missio Dei, to say the intention of God is communion. Koinonia is the union between God and humanity. It's the work of the Spirit to raise the church up to communion with God, and that is a missional orientation. It's not just to teach people theology. It's not just to have people read the Bible and know the stories of the Bible. It literally has the end that people would have the mission fulfilled because they would have a communion with God through the work of what it is that the missionary brings. and that the nature of the church is to bring the covenant of God, the covenanting God, not a contract God, but a covenanting God. And the church exists to bring into its fullness the fulfillment of the mission to be a people gathered to God. And so to say the nature of what happens with a missionary on the mission field should be informing what happens in the classroom in Edinburgh to train theologians to think missionally, and that the goal isn't just definitions and arguments, but it's for peoples to have communal connection with God and one another so that the intention of the missional God is being fulfilled. Does that make sense?
And then she gets into the concept of the missional role of Israel
Right.
under that heading, koinonia.
Yeah.
She says it plays a key role in Torrance's ecclesiology, the role of Israel as God's covenant people, the Jewish church.
Yeah. And Bart sees the Yahweh Israel Jesus church is a continuum not to be separated. And so the sense that to say whatever the missional work is that Torrance participated in, it shouldn't be separated either from Israel or from the historic church, but should be seen as a continuing going out into the world, because all of theology is this going out into the world. And it's the scientific component of Torrance's work should be seen as another manifestation of the same desire to communicate, to make known, to go out as covenant people.
And the Israel and Christian church, the Israel and the Christian church have different roles to play. The Christian church carries the dark side of the cross into history through the role as the scapegoat that's cast out and scattered over the earth. And she even references his, speaking of the Holocaust, has begun to open Christians' eyes to the missional role of Israel, missional role of Israel.
Yeah.
As the scapegoat that is now drawn into the heart and center of Calvary through suffering, giving the church a new conception of Israel's role in the atonement.
Yeah. And it's Israel the people, not Israel the state necessarily.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? It's referred to here in this essay as the Jew, and is quoted in quotes, Jewish church carries the dark side of the cross into history.
Yeah.
So the Christian church and the Jewish church have different roles to play yet.
Yeah.
Thus, the Christian church and the Jewish church, although currently divided, have a missional role to play in the history of the last days.
Yeah.
And references Torrance 1992. I don't see what that is right now, but that's the reference to it on page under koinonia that you were just reading.
And I was looking to see what 92 is. That's the mediation of Christ is Torrance 92.
Collier says that Torrance's argument that the vicarious role of Israel in mediation of reconciliation continues in the present age.
Yeah.
He says it's, quote, unquote, astonishing as well as insightful.
Yeah.
I thought that was...
Karl Barth has major sections on Romans 9 through 11, that Israel is those who have the covenants and all that, but have resisted him, and God loves them anyway. It is a sign of the unconditional love of God, and therefore part of the mission of the gospel that God loves Israel, the Church of Israel, even in its rebellion, as well as the Gentile church being brought into that as well. That we should not think ourselves better or anything. We need to see the depth of God's love for them, to know that we're pretty much just as bad, and he loves us too, just as we are. And so it's the unconditionalness of grace and the covenant of God with humanity. And we would love to be judges in place of God of Israel, but no, God's going to still be the judge, and he's judged them, his children.
Well, I'll tell you, that paragraph um, under the covenant and the church, right after Koinonia, that begins
Yeah.
with Collier and talking about being astonishing. That whole thing, it gets back to the ancient Israelites of the Chiang, the blood sacrifice, the
Yep.
Azazel ceremony, all of that. That's a dynamite paragraph there. Is worth rereading. I think after we're
You're,
done here.
you're starting at this concept.
Say again?
Were you starting at this concept in the right-hand column? I was just looking. Where were you beginning that when you
Oh,
said that
well, it's on page 5, I think it is. No,
Okay.
page 7. I'm sorry, not page
Page
5.
7.
Page
Yep.
7. Koine on the right hand side, beginning Collier.
Uh-huh.
Collier finds Torrance's argument on the right hand
Yeah.
side, page 7. Yeah,
Yeah.
that
But the
whole paragraph.
vicarious role of Israel in the mediation of reconciliation continues in the present age. Yeah. I mean, there's a continuity here, isn't there? Astonishing as well as insightful. It can only be understood when considered within the context of Torrance's interaction with the king.
Yeah,
Torrance Sr.'s claim that these people were ancient Israelites sent to bear witness to the need for atonement through the blood sacrifice was based on their scapegoat ceremony that he interpreted as the Azazel ceremony of Leviticus 16. C.F. Torrance's endorsement in 1988 of the second edition of his father's book shows that, although the authenticity of the Jewish origins of the Jing could not be established, he supported his father's understanding of the missional role of the Israelites in the world. So
in the
there's the
world.
continuity. Yeah.
Are you, Marty, are you familiar with Rene Girard?
I mean, I certainly know of Gerard. To say that I have his forms of thought in my head would not be true. I
Yeah.
know the mimic
But
thinking.
he's big on the scapegoat theology that Jesus was the scapegoat
Uh,
and uses that as a alternative to the suffering punishment of Christ. But there were several references, and I kept wondering if maybe that wasn't floating
mm,
around in the back of her mind or something, because it would fit in a lot with what she's saying that
yeah,
Torrance saw happening with the theology of the Ching people here.
right.
I don't know. It might be worth a letter or something to her to see what she thinks. I don't know.
But
Yeah.
anyway, that paragraph plus that footnote 24, Torrance's quote in footnote 24 is interesting. I found one of
Yes.
the most interesting parts of this.
Which that footnote reads, I am convinced that the origins of the Chang and their religion lie deep in antiquity in the prehistory of ancient Israel. What I find particularly startling, however, is that the religious observances of the Ching seem to derive from a period in Israel's history before Moses, and certainly before the centralization of the cult of Jerusalem had been carried out when high place worship was still prevalent. That was 1988 of Torrance's work. So again,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
amusing, but also a sense something is going on here that we should listen to, is kind of what I hear him saying.
yeah. Something is. Well, I just find it very interesting. That's all. I
Yeah,
don't see 1988.
that's at the end of that quote. It's just the
Yeah, yeah. I was looking for it. Oh, here it is. China's first missionaries, ancient Israelites, T.F. Torrance, 1988, second edition. Do you have that one? China's
I
first
don't
missionary, ancient Israelites.
I don't have that. That's Shaw.
Whoa, that's an interesting book title. I didn't know Torrance. I had no idea. I'm not familiar at all with that.
My sense
1988.
is that the T in that is Father Torrance. That says
Oh,
Ed,
that's the
T.F. Torrance.
republication. Yeah, that's the republication of his father's book. Okay,
Yeah.
I got it.
So there you go. There you go.
Okay,
Mystery solved.
yeah,
And I don't have that book, but I may have to look for it.
yeah, yeah.
So
Okay.
the last paragraph then on page 8 of that section, under the new covenant, the creation of the church is a function of the work of the Holy Spirit, who forms the empirical community of people who are called into being by the gospel, indwelt by the Spirit, and in union with Christ are joined to God. In Christ and by the Spirit, the church participates in the communion of love that is the essence of the Trinity, and therefore participates in the outflowing of the love of God to the world in the mission of Christ. And so there's the tying of all of Torrance's theology is a participation in the mission of God, and we shouldn't see them separately, really. So, and that would be to say too, all science should have the purpose of God too, to go out to the world to give, what does it mean to understand what is there, why it's there, how we care for it. That is all an outworking of that same idea. No church without a mission, no science without a mission. Right? There's meaning and purpose behind all of it. So then the conjunction of theology and mission practice through the Missio Dei, the idea of holism. Dr. Seed is going to suggest that for Torrance, growing up in a culture, i.e. Chinese culture here, that didn't break things apart like we do, gave him a cultural intuition to think holistically in a way that much of modern science does not. A penchant towards a unitary approach is the phrase that's here to theology that was able to flourish as he studied under Mackintosh, Barth, and Lamont, and he read early church fathers. So again, to say there is a sense that much of theology tends to break things apart and see chapters in books of systematic theology that all become very, in a sense, fractured. But Torrance did have a sense of always look at the whole, and Einstein had that sense as well, who, of course, Einstein had Jewish roots, which would have come from a holistic understanding as well. And again, the last little paragraph there, under the influence of his theological mentors, it enabled him to develop an integrative Trinitarian theology centered on the homoousial relation of Father, Son, Spirit, through which the incarnation acts as an axis intersecting space and time. The realism of the incarnation as a historical event means that theology can never be confined to the realm of the abstract, breaking things apart, but always has outcomes in the practice of mission, a whole world with God involved in the missional life of God. So there are some final practical outcomes of recognizing out of the theology that engages people's, how we rethink what evangelical and evangelizing means, that the nature of the role of Israel clarifies things, a unitary worldview, brings things together. On the top of page 9 of 10 there, Torrance does not engage directly with the practice of mission in his work and can thus not be labeled a missiologist, which I don't know who gets to put these, who gets to label people. To say he's mission-minded certainly seems to be true there. He wasn't studying the history of missions, though he was in a particular place maybe. However, his theology of divine human communion is saturated with missional outcomes that are lived out in his lifelong engagement in mission with China. And that was D.W. Torrance, David Torrance, who said that. The practical outcomes of Torrance's theology are therefore to be found in his personal mission history. But his personal mission history was personally tied up with the triune God and the church and all that. So I would say there's no separation there, that the whole of who he is formed in the context of the personal God and communities with whom he related. So then there's a conclusion. Go ahead.
Anything else is paper theology.
Yes.
David Torrance quote.
David Torrance, yes.
If you don't harmonize theology, preaching, and daily life together.
Just paper theology.
Paper theology.
So the conclusion, there's 3 points in there: that Torrance's family participation was significant. Secondly, the participation in evangelism in China there exposed him to concepts that lead him to think about the Israeli biblical, the ongoing work of God in the world. And thirdly, the unitary nature of Chinese culture engendered in him a sense of a more holistic view of theology, where perichoretic interrelations and all that seems to find its natural kind of place. So those are the three things that this author sees as potentially helpful outcomes from it all. The last sentence in that conclusion, therefore, attention to the significance of his mission work among the Cheng will enable future scholarship to consider Torrance's mission practice as integral to and not separate from his theology of the missional nature of the divine human communion. I think it's a worthy statement to be made that we can't isolate out parts of Torrance, but we always have to consider the whole and the way each informs the other parts. And it enriches our understanding of him and the work and even the things he didn't get to when that is done. She has the author's contribution and again, that the other names that are on it, I don't know why they do this. Authors, Carolyn Seed, Daniel Loy, and Rikas Fick. She's the author, and they are the supervisors, basically. So
Yeah.
she is the one who is, I think, to be quoted there, and her doctorate is her doctorate. Same two people are listed there as those who are basically the supervisors in the project. But obviously, she did some serious work in reading broadly in mission studies and going to Princeton and Princeton studies and in Torrance studies there, etc. So, hello, Tim.
Yep. You got to turn your sound.
Hi, everyone.
It's good to see
Christmas
you.
greetings.
Yes.
And Boxing Day, do you celebrate Boxing Day in Ireland?
Sorry,
Do you celebrate
hard of
Boxing
hearing
Day?
today.
Do you celebrate Boxing Day in Ireland?
Yeah, we have Boxing Day. I don't know what we really do. We just try and get over the exertions of the day before, I think, Mark. I think that's probably the best way of putting it.
Okay, very good.
That's about the most casual, quick-witted comment I think I've ever made on Reading Group Forum.
Bravo.
So, I'm actually slapping myself on the back for being able to ad lib. I'm learning slowly after about 6 years of effort.
Yes. Well, one of the things I
done.
got for Christmas was a bottle of Irish cream from Cork County, Ireland. So my stepson gave that to me. So, well, very
Good
good.
stuff.
Well, hopefully this has been, hopefully it's invigorated all kinds of new conversations, but also added some depth to the integrating
marvelous.
of Torrance's thinking and the possibilities that are there.
Yeah, Marty, see if you can get Dr. Skandrick back on again. I think that's going to be good.
We'll see what we can do with him. He's generally pretty amiable, so
Yeah.
we will check it out. Yeah, there's many seeds that this article has in it, but I think it's a nice thing to read along with theological science because it helps you to just see the breadth of all that he's thinking out of, even in a book like Theological Science. So, many blessings on you, and we'll see you next year on January the 2nd, and we'll be back into Theological Science, and Ken Ross is going to take that session for us. So anyway,
Super.
have a celebratory few days until we get there. Enjoy the Happy New Year, and 2025,
Yes.
here it comes.
Yeah. Bow not a knee.
Thank you, Marty.
Okay. You betcha. Blessings on you, friends.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.